We estimated that in total, this would bring the EU very high cost of 367.8 billion euros over the next 5 years.
We're caught between a rock and a hard place.
The bottom line is that the European Union is entirely deviating from free trade, totally destroy the economic order established after the Second World War.
Are you willing to sacrifice your own industry and manufacturing for the so-called security, which could not be a problem and could actually be enhanced by Chinese ecosystem?
No, I won't call it irreversible. At least European consumers still very much love products coming from China.
There will be people in the European Union who understand the importance of good relationships with China, and we just have to work hard at keeping them going.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyun. Joining me to decode the European Union's accelerating de-Sinicization push, Ms. LIANG Linlin, the Director of Communication and Research at the China Chamber of Commerce to the European Union in Brussels. Dr. Glen, the Chief Economist at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, is also a visiting fellow of the Cranfield School of Management in the United Kingdom, and Dr. Gong, a professor with the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. A warm welcome to you all, ladies and gentlemen. So the EU has recently rolled out a series of policies expanding its so-called de-risking strategy. One of the latest proposals would require companies in key sectors across the bloc to source critical components from at least 3 different suppliers. Ms. Liang, since you're with the China Chamber of Commerce, shall we begin with you? What are those key industries, and why is the move widely seen as targeting Chinese-made products?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Right, we are closely following what's happening there. And as for the China Chamber of Commerce to the EU, as our members are really direct target of this move. So we have been following this development for quite a long time. This is with quite profound impact on our operations and so on. But what we can observe and or to register is that our members and the wider Chinese business community are faced with this barrier in some specific sectors quite a long time. And when you ask what are the key sectors, what I can name at the moment, what the media reported are the chemical sector and high-end machinery. But let me just bring you also to the attention to other sectors. We have also difficulties in sectors like biotech, the medical facility area, and also, for instance, in the very advanced leading clean tech areas as well. There are another chunk of this area that the EU is looking into, for instance, in security-related facilities like scanned machines and whatever. So basically, I think we are targeted in those areas. Basically, let's say that the Chinese companies have a leading strength that they are probably in the areas that Chinese companies can pose the competitive competition to the local suppliers, I guess. So basically, this is the situation that we are faced with, and we are still following the situation and we'll try to get more details about it to see how to address it individually or jointly.
Right, thank you. And Dr. Gong, from your side, is it like overreading into it? Your take here.
Okay, well, I think it's a gross underestimation of what the European Union is coming from. I want to spend a few minutes to talk about the background and what's the reasons behind this. It's a combination of several reasons. One has to do with this conflict in Ukraine. The European side views China as standing together with the Russian side, and Russia is basically right now engaging a proxy war with the entire Europe. So, viewing China as being sided with the Russian side, which is totally untrue in my view, imparts a sort of a hostile sentiment towards Chinese businesses operating in Europe. I mean, that's one theory. And the other theory has to do with the view that the European industrial sector's manufacturing is totally incompetitive and is lagging behind further and further vis-a-vis Chinese competition. They view that the competition from China is more than just about a trade deficit, but is starting to deeply erode into industrial capabilities, manufacturing capabilities of European companies. Given that several companies, in many industries, in Europe, in particularly in France and Germany and Italy, are getting less competitive with the influx of manufactured products from China. There's this political forces to try to protect essentially European industries. I mean, it is more from a protectionist point of view. The third thing has to do with the cross-Atlantic politics, actually. Europe sees that the Trump administration views the European Union essentially as an enemy. And Europe needs to develop its own indigenous industries, needs to be more independent. A lot of manufacturings are inherently related to defense capabilities. And therefore, there's a need to develop those, very critical industries that are closely related to defense. So, all of these things, sort of combined is contributing to the idea that Europe needs to be risking from China. I mean, de-risking is only related to the first motivation, as I just described. But this is not the whole story. I mean, it's only part of the story. Now, having said that, there are also divisions and differences in views with respect to these theories, three theories within the European Union. Some countries are more akin to the first theory. For example, these Nordic states, Baltic states, Poland, these countries are tied to very much to the first theory. Industrial powers in Europe, like, France, in particular Germany in particular, they're more enamored with the second theory. And there are also other countries that are actually not so much buying into this, all of these things, like Spain and Greece, some other European countries.
Dr. Gong, it seems
let
you're...
me finish. This is very important. Let me finish.
Okay.
So a combination of these forces are at work, and the European Union is trying these theories and come up with sort of, seemingly legitimate, radically extremely complicated schemes to essentially fend off free trade from China, including the policies of our first panelist mentioned, foreign subsidy regulation and other things related to national security, for example. The bottom line is that the European Union is entirely deviating from free trade. It's entirely deviating from the spirits of the WTO and developing something unilaterally to essentially hamper free trade and totally destroy the economic order established after the Second World War.
Seems that you've had a very general conclusion of what's happening.
I mean, this is
yes, I know.
I mean,
we are now trying to explain their policies one by one. Just first focus on this one. It's requiring companies in key sectors across the bloc to source components from at least 3 different suppliers. Do you agree it's specifically targeting Chinese-made products, or is it overreading into it?
Of course. I mean, the schemes they have developed doesn't mention China. They're saying, this is in general just about foreign subsidy regulation. But if you dig deeper inside this, I mean, it's very clear. It's tailor-made for China. I don't see any of these policies targeting any other countries. It's basically targeting China.
But there's, I believe, more than one supplier on the market, right? So why can you be more specific? Why it's specifically targeting Chinese-made products then?
I've just said because of these 3 theories, because of geopolitical concern, because of the de-risking need, because of the protection of European companies and the European industries. And lastly, it has to do with the defense industry. They want to be more autonomous away from the United States. All of these things combined together, contributing to essentially a policy of protecting high-end, high manufacturing industries in Europe.
Or maybe Chinese products are dominant on the EU market right now, or...
I wouldn't say dominant. I would say they are more technologically advanced, they are more economically viable, and they're more welcomed by customers.
Okay. Then to Dr. Glen, I understand the UK is not part of EU anymore, but I believe you've been following this and has a lot to say about this. What does this mean for European businesses already struggling with high costs and weak growth?
So if we just go back to Dr. Zhong's comments, because I think he's provided a very lucid analysis of what's actually happening. I don't really want to comment on the first thesis that there's an anti-Chinese feeling because of what's going on in Ukraine. I have to say that I don't see that in the narrative here, but I may be misreading it. Okay. Right. Secondly, what has happened over the last 20 years at least is that the European Union has benefited vastly from trading relations with China. What has happened is we have had an enormous supply of low cost and increasingly very high quality inputs from China, which has contributed to the competitiveness of EU products. What we now find is that as a result of free trade, China has got a degree of dominance in some of those input sectors, not final goods sectors, but now the issue is about what we might call tier one suppliers. And the European Union has woken up, mainly because, as you say, we're not growing. There's unemployment in some of these tier one sectors. They're not able to compete with Chinese inputs, and realize that we're in a situation where we're highly dependent upon China. So what then happens are two things. You can politically say that this represents a risk, okay? And it represents a risk, particularly if we look at geopolitics of the last 10 years, okay, in Europe. And I'm not directly talking about geopolitics vis-a-vis China, but I mean, who would have expected a Brexit? Who would have expected that we had to deal with COVID? Who would have expected a war in Ukraine? Who would have expected the United States and Israel attacking Iran? So there is a lot of uncertainty there, and a lot of uncertainty that we didn't have prior to that. So what then happens is you can have one set of people inside the European Union who are saying that we are strategically at risk if we don't maintain these tier one suppliers. You can have another set of people who are saying that we're not competing. And so what do? And this is Professor John's thesis, is we run to the regulator and we ask for protectionism. And we say, we liked free trade when it was working in our favor, but we don't like free trade when it doesn't work for us. Now, the only thing that I would say, and I would ask Dr. John to consider, is if the Chinese government found that 100% of tier one suppliers into your critical industries were European, would they do something about changing that? And I think they probably would, okay? They'd probably say that this is not a situation that we want. It's not in China's interest for that to be the case, and we have to do something about it. But I do agree with Dr. John, and it's typical all over the world, and it's not just the European Union, that if you want protectionism, the first thing you do is run to the regulator. And very often, secondly, what you say is these industries are strategically important to us, and therefore you must protect us. And you get crazy things like, historically, the people who sew badges on the US Army uniforms have said, we're a critical industry, you must protect us, which is craziness. Now, the fourth thing that I would like to say, and just I need to come back on the geopolitics, is at the present moment, I would argue that Europe views China as the potential provider of a solution to what is going on in the Straits of Hormuz and what is going on in Iran. So rather than seeing China as somebody geopolitically who is not on our side, we are very much holding out that I always say that with respect to what's going on in Iran, we need adults to enter the room. At the moment, I think those adults are going to be Chinese adults who broker a peace outcome, which is both good for the European Union and for the broader global economy.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Well, thanks for your acknowledgement of the Chinese side. But let's zoom in. Yes, we know that there is double standard there, and we know that maybe the EU is very much contradictory on its position. But our discussion needs to first take a specific look at some of the newly adopted policies by Brussels so that we can see whether it's reasonable for the EU side. Or now back to the specific policies or rules they've adopted. I'm wondering how much more expensive could procurement or logistics and inventory management become if the EU asked its companies to diversify their procurement from at least, 3 different suppliers. I'm not sure if the Chinese chambers got any calculation there, Ms. Liang.
We did. We actually did the economic assessment impact on the, but we did that one on cybersecurity at revision, because this new proposal or the CSA2, it asks the member states to dismantle some Chinese suppliers in a couple of years, and then crossing 18 key sectors. So we did the calculation, we did the estimate with KPMG, and it was just released 2 weeks ago. We estimated that in total, this would bring the EU 27 member states very high cost of 367.8 billion euros over the next 5 years.
Right.
So it's quite clear the number is quite staggering. And among different EU member states, Germany will suffer most. I think it will have to be imposed like a cost of 171 billion euros. Unfortunately, even though the legislation is not yet in place and is still under discussion, the impact is imminent. And we already found some of our Chinese companies are already faced with the, as I said, the obstacles, and they were excluded already. So the negative impact or the economic cost, I think, is started already. But we estimate that the real cost, if the CSA2 writes into law, then I think the major, very substantial economic loss will come beginning in 2 years. We got a response from the Commission. I think what the Commission responded was that it's not about money or not about cost. Yeah, no, you're right. That the Commission responded with saying it's not about money, not about cost, but about security. I know, Professor Zheng, you just mentioned that the thing is that, of course, that I think cybersecurity is a legitimate concern to all authorities, all citizens, and the public. But one question we would like to ask is that, first of all, we think, in our perspective, actually Chinese companies can contribute to the cybersecurity, to the security of the EU industry or manufacturing. First of all, there is no major record of the major violation in these sectors. Secondly, we think that it's about the overstretching of the concept of security. And it's not only about the core sector, it's rolling and expands in so many sectors. As what the Commission proposed, it will cross 18 key sectors, and basically that's the critical sectors that involve everywhere: finance, logistics, and green renewable sectors, not to mention the ICT sectors, and even the research. So what we want to say is that, yeah, right. It's not about the cost or not about the money. We can understand that, but isn't it way too much, or isn't it the result or consequences of overreacting? And it is unnecessary cost. It's the least to say unnecessary. It actually will bring very profound negative impact on the green and digital transitions in the EU. And if you argue it's not about the cost, but actually it will bring the huge cost on the competitiveness, on the manufacturing. Are you willing to, let's say, to sacrifice your own industry and manufacturing for the so-called security, which could not be a problem and could actually be enhanced by Chinese ecosystem? If Chinese companies are not regarded trustful or, let's say, compliant with but there are so many technological, international recognized criteria which can prove that Chinese companies can largely contribute to security, not the opposite. And I think this is a fundamental question. So for us, in the end, it's actually about the trust in the end. This is the problem of trust. It's not really a problem of security, because there's no trust on the Chinese suppliers. It's the deficit of the trust, and this will lead to the deficit of the economic cost. Yeah.
You're saying that policymakers in the EU have turned probably irrational, like what Dr. Glen just mentioned. It's not acting like an adult. Dr. Gong have already mentioned it's been politicized already. That's all we all understand. But is this kind of trend will it continue then? There won't be any U-turn.
Right. You know what? We discussed quite a lot about de-risking. We saw some measures, and I think they are associated not with de-risking from China, and instead is about decoupling. And I think that this really is quite concerning. I think it will be detrimental not only to trade, but also the stability of the economic relationship. Because if how China has reacted over the two legislations, the IAA and CSA2, while a lot of people are talking about the countermeasures towards Europe. So we worry that this could be the beginning of the downward spiral, and I think that's the last thing that the business community would like to see.
Right. Then to Dr. Glen. Well, the EU actually often speaks about supply chain resilience, yet it remains deeply dependent on China's industrial ecosystem. So from your perspective, does the EU truly have the capacity to replace Chinese supply chains anytime soon, since, it's already decided it will have to, replace? Or
look, the simple answer to that is no, or a slightly more complex answer, as the previous speakers just said, is that you do it at quite significant costs. But I like this de-risking, decoupling comparison, because I think de-risking is about a mature international relationship, which is about rules-based relationships, which is about negotiation on what is best for both sides. Now, I have to say, for 20 years, I've been talking about procurement from China. For 20 years, I've been hitting a message which says procurement for China cannot just be about lower price and better quality. Procurement from China has to be about relationship. And unfortunately, in a kind of Western European, North American culture, relationships are much more transactional than deep and based on trust. And of course, the key thing about trust is that trust is, it de-risks, okay? If you have trust in a relationship and you get a situation where one party can behave opportunistically compared to the other, it's trust that stops people doing that. It's trust that negotiates a win-win for all in that situation. So I think that we need to start developing deeper relationships. We need to start developing relationships which are based on trust.
But if there is no trust, I mean, it's not that China doesn't trust Europe. It's the other way around, right? If there's no trust, how can you deepen this relationship?
Yeah, well, I think that's where the European Union now, and in a way, what they're going to say, I know maybe the starting point seems quite aggressive, but in a way, what they're actually trying to do is say, look, can we have a conversation about how the situation that's operating against us can move to somewhere that's more favorable, but we all come out of this in a relationship that is good for both sides. So I think there's a degree to which Europe now has got to enter into more mature negotiations with China. And I think to that point, it's about Europe actually saying there are massive benefits which have been clearly articulated of dealing with China. We have some concerns. We have to make sure that those concerns are addressed. And by the way, you know, if you want to support your own industries, the best way to do that is via subsidy, which you could argue that the sort of state capitalism of China has been very good in the progression of Chinese industries over the last 20 or 30 years. But we don't have that culture in Europe. So we don't have a culture where subsidy, which Dr. John will tell you from a welfare perspective is probably the most efficient way of protecting your industries, is not a consideration in Europe because philosophically we're against subsidy as well. So we're caught in Western parlance, we would say we're caught between a rock and a hard place. And what we need to do is find our way out of it. But again, I would, and please forgive me now, Western people talking about Sun Tzu and the art of war. But one of the key learnings from that is that when your opponent is in a difficult position, make sure that you give them a way of getting out of that position and you don't create a fight to the death, because none of us want that. So we are in a difficult position. We are getting pressure from some of our very old, very traditional industries, particularly, as you say, in Germany and France, that are not competing on an international basis. And we need to work our way through this and see how that's going to come out. And again, from an individual business perspective, many of those businesses who are being told, you know, we've got to go 60-40 as far as Chinese procurement is concerned, are going to push that as hard as they can to procure more than 60% from China, because they know there are a massive advantage to doing so.
I'm not following that exactly. You're saying that China got to this position or its dominance on the market because, I won't say entirely, but partly because of its subsidies, right? So you're saying Brussels has every reason to do what it is doing right now, or?
No, I would say that China has used subsidy in the past, and that for me, and again, I think Dr. John will agree, from an economic perspective, when you're making your way in this world, there's an infant industry argument that says subsidy is perfectly acceptable. You then need to remove it when you become mature. Chinese industries are mature. They can compete on an international basis without subsidy. Okay. Now the danger is that perversely that whole argument is being reversed. And we who were perceived to be the advanced economies are no longer winning in that game of international trade. And now there's a clamber to try and protect those industries. Okay.
So that makes Brussels' moves plausible or reasonable?
Pardon?
That makes what Brussels is doing, you know, introducing all those policies more plausible.
It provides an explanation of what they're doing.
Sure.
I'm not so sure it provides a justification of what they're doing.
Okay.
Okay. So you could argue that if they were going to protect, they could protect in better ways. You could argue that rather than coming in and protecting in this way, they actually enter into the negotiation, which is about de-risking rather than decoupling. So go into those negotiations, again, behind closed doors, away from the glare of publicity, and enter into the hard negotiations that say, this is the situation that we're in, these are our concerns, how can we get a win-win relationship, which to your point is based on trust rather than based on a transactional relationship. And I will hold my hands up and say, for the past 20 years, that many relationships with China from the European basis have been transactional, and we've taken advantage of the high quality, low price goods rather than building up the trust, which would then allow these conversations to occur.
This has been the Chat Lounge. Then how might Beijing respond to the EU's latest series of unfriendly measures? We'll explore that right after the break.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
It seems what's happening right now is not in the direction Dr. Glen just mentioned. So what went wrong, Dr. Gong?
What went wrong? For too long, we just, to put it in an extreme way, we feasted on the high quality, low price outputs that China provided for us. And when I'm teaching my macroeconomics classes, I say to the students, well, monetary policy tells us that if you increase the money supply, you get very, very high levels of inflation. Well, why has that not happened since 2008? We've had massive increases in the money supply, and we've had no real increase in consumer price inflation if you ignore Ukraine and what's going on in Iran at the moment, which are black swan events. Okay, and the reason for that is we could pump money into our system, we could demand more goods and services, and we didn't get price inflation because those goods and services were provided at low cost because of the inputs from China. Simple. We created a manufacturing hub in China, which was of a magnitude beyond our belief. Yep. Okay, and that kept our prices down.
I mean, you said both sides should conduct some negotiations, probably closed-door negotiations, but it's not what's happening right now, right? So from that perspective, I mean, what went wrong? Hasn't such negotiations been carried out between both sides? I mean, probably to Ms. Liang.
I'll make a final comment here.
Okay.
I would really like to hear Dr. John's view on this. In any negotiation, you need to separate rhetoric from reality. You need to separate what is being said. And sometimes, when I teach negotiation, I talk about anchoring. You put a stake in the ground that is sometimes very extreme. It's not a good way of negotiating, but it's a simplistic way. So sometimes you say extreme things, and then that's the basis from which you start negotiating. So I think that's what's happening. There's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of heat, and now what we need to do is get behind those closed doors and deal with reality. And again, I think this notion of de-risking rather than decoupling is massively important.
Dr. Gong?
I would like to go back to the first argument about 100% sourcing from China versus maybe 60% sourcing or 50% sourcing from China. I think if we interpret the European policy from that angle, if it's indeed the case, I think it's a perfectly workable problem. It's I have a lot of understanding of that issue. Yeah. But the problem is that it's way more than that. I think I just want to quote a statement made by European High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, who said just yesterday, and you can see from her statement, this is entirely way more than a 100% versus 60% issue. Yeah. She said, so we in Europe has a very clear understanding of the diagnosis of the disease when it comes to China's coercive economic practices. And she continues to say, if you have a very difficult disease, if you have a cancer, okay, you have two choices, either increase the morphine or you start chemotherapy. That's what Carlos said, okay. Now, clearly what European Union is doing right now, I see this as the beginning of a chemotherapy here. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's not morphine, right? So I think the leadership at the European Union is something that China would never be able to persuade. These people, totally ideologically minded people. And I think China and China's commerce in European Union would be better off by talking to the countries that still want to keep this, working relationship. Countries like Germany, Spain, Slovakia, Greece, for example, who don't buy into this sort of strongly opinionated geopolitical, ideologically oriented thinking in Brussels. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say, John, by the way, thanks for inviting me to speak, is respect to the subsidy issue here. I think we have to be very careful about what we mean by subsidy. The WTO has a very clear treaty on preventing subsidies. And these are subsidies typically associated with initial development, R&D, research, that kind of thing. It prohibits subsidy with respect to production. It prohibits subsidies with respect to exports. And I think exports and production, there's no evidence that Chinese companies are being subsidized by the Chinese government. As a matter of fact, the cars, for example, electric cars being sold in Europe are way more expensive than cars being sold here in China. That's the first thing about subsidies. The European Union's policy with respect to subsidies that goes beyond the WTO, which is unilateral in nature. I'm talking about foreign subsidy regulation, this new act coming from the European Union. These are things all unilateral and go way beyond the WTO consensus. And as a matter of fact, even when it comes to these kind of things, okay, we're talking about mostly initial development, R&D subsidies, stuff like that. I totally reject the notion that European Union doesn't have a culture of subsidy. European Union has the world's most famous example of state subsidies with respect to the Airbus development. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent by the European Union to get this project started. There's a history of over 10 years of litigation between the United States and the European Union with respect to the commercial jet subsidy. Many evidence can be dug out, how much money is being spent on this. So it's something that I would say both sides, European Union and China, have done in the past. It's a matter of scale. It's a matter of being done right now or in the past. And also, Chinese government is trying to remedy this problem. We have policies now these days to essentially prohibit regional governments, city governments to make subsidies for these initial startup companies, things like that. And things are indeed changing. Now, I think if both sides have a level of trust and these problems can be worked out, and if the true motivation behind the European Union is really about, trying to prevent these things from happening again, I think there's still foundation, there's still room for engaging in meaningful discussion. But when we hear, speeches like from Kaja Kallas calling China a cancer, right, and essentially start chemotherapy, I don't think it's that simple anymore. I don't think it's all about economics anymore. It's about money anymore. I think this is, treating China essentially as an adversary, if not an enemy. And I think, this is actually very dangerous thinking in Brussels right now. And, I don't see any hope between the European Union and China if the current leadership in Brussels keep its place. I think we have to weigh changes in some key major powers in Europe to maybe change things in Brussels. Until that happens, I don't see much of a hope.
To Ms. Liang, so from an enterprise's perspective or from the chamber's perspective, what went wrong? I believe Chinese companies, they also try to, talk to EU authorities, and some talks are happening right now. But after hearing what Dr. Glen and Dr. Gong just said, what do you think has gone wrong, has led to this, I should say, awkward situation between the two sides right now?
Well, I think China and the EU had a honeymoon before, probably 1 decade ago. But then we found a lot of landmark cases, for instance. From the business point of view, you can see how FDI screening was developed, right? It was triggered by the acquisition of a Chinese company over the German the robotic company. And I think all in all, we can find that in 2019, when the EU defines China as a cooperator and a competitor and a systemic rival, simultaneously, that was the beginning of a lot of measures. And then so I think the perspective of its approach towards China has changed dramatically over the past few years. And in reality, the mindset of China being a rival rather than economic cooperator, I think it overweights other considerations, and you see is more often dominated a lot of policies presented by the EU bubble. If you ask what's the problem of the confrontation, or now we are, for instance, in Europe, they are discussing the China shocks. it is also coincides with the decline of the EU's competitiveness, which was very precisely dinosaurs in Draghi's report. And then again, now, from our view, is that the Chinese companies or the Chinese business or the trade from China actually could stabilize the relationship, could contribute, and there's also the appetite from the Chinese business to further contribute to advance the twin transitions in the EU. And the one very important thing is that a lot of issues that which we know is of high concern to Europeans, for instance, about the security, and naturally this can be governed by the technological terms, can be governed by the criteria, and we have very clearly standards on that. We can govern all those disputes, or if we call it, or conflicts, if we call it. The thing is that, again, too politicized, and the business is too politicized, and economic topics are quite politicized. So now, when we talk about economic times or the business issues, it's just no more economic anymore. It's no more about trade anymore. It's more about, again, security and trust. And you rightly said, probably is one way trust deficit from the EU side, that China still regards the EU as a partner. I think that could serve as a point that yesterday we had quite a discussion with also the chief economist from the German side, and they argue that it's like between Canada and China and between the US and China, that why not EU and China can think about some major deals, to govern our disputes or conflicts if there are. I mean, there are not. It's not a fundamental conflicts. It's more about frictions in the three areas. That it is time for us to think about. And if from a business point of view, I think that would be absolutely welcome. That would be a grand deal presented by the two sides to govern the current frictions or controversies. Yeah. And for instance, related to subsidies and related to so-called capacity and so on and so on. The thing is that we don't see the same level of engagement between China and the EU in comparison to, for instance, China and the US, or of course between the transatlantic partners. So I think that would be great if there are enough engagement and dialogues from both sides on the governmental sector. And then for the business community, I can confirm to our audience that in particular for Chinese and European business, we have extremely good intention to cooperate with each other, and we are already partners to each other in both Chinese and European market and the third market. So I think the obstacles or barriers are more on the political front, not on the business front.
Indeed.
But we would like to contribute to the constructive discussion.
Yeah, indeed. It seems the businesses on both sides have not that big a problem with each other, but is it just that those who have the say that wouldn't want to budge or make any concession only because of the so-called pride or dignity, the pitiful face issue that on some or a few EU officials? Is that the problem, that both sides cannot be on the same page, Dr. Glen?
I think that to the comment that was made about, if you have a cancer, you need to start chemotherapy. I think that's an appalling comment for any politician to make in the context of trying to responsibly manage trade negotiations. But again, I did make this comment earlier, and it's something that we have to be mindful of. With the whole geopolitical context at the moment, there's a lot of noise. There are a lot of people, conducting negotiations over social media platforms rather than through normal, international relationship channels. So I think what we need to do, and again, I concur with both the previous speakers, you have to go back to the people who are actually impacted by this, not the politicians who are playing to some protectionist, anti-foreigner. It just happens to be the Chinese in this context. In some instances, it could be North America. In some instances, it can be Greenland. It can be Canada. It can be Mexico. It can be whoever. It's very hard to ignore that noise. I admit it's incredibly insulting and unpleasant language. But underneath, and I think Dr. John and Linlin concurred to this, is that there are people who want to do business with China and who need to develop those closer relationships with China, and it's not in their interest to decouple. And I think it's ignoring the noise, getting to those people and getting on with those negotiations. And then maybe at a more senior level, at a governmental level, trying to get governments to dampen that noise. And you saw President Xi did a fantastic job with President Trump in the latest meeting where, the narrative became much more positive. The narrative was dampened down. There wasn't this heightened aggressive language. And that's what we've got to try and remove. And I have to say, there is an appetite for that language amongst some of the electorate in Europe. I promise you that language it may feel as if it's been aimed at China, but it's for domestic consumption. It's not for international consumption. But again, it doesn't excuse appalling language like that. So we have to get on. We have to realize that there is benefit in trade relationships between both blocks, between the Chinese bloc and the EU bloc. I think it's a mistake, to Linlin's comment, that negotiations with Europe aren't as advanced as they are with the rest of the world. I think there is an opportunity, and Premier Carney in Canada would probably support this. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but a movement away from North America and a movement towards China is something that you might see, maybe not geopolitically, but definitely economically. I think there are big advantages to doing that, given the current state of affairs between Europe and North America. And again, I know Dr. John said at the beginning that Trump sees Europe as an enemy. And again, it's an appalling deterioration in relationship between North America and Europe. But we see that, I have to promise you, in Europe as more of a problem with the President of the United States than with the United States. We think that that's something that will be resolved once this administration is removed.
Right.
And we get back to more, just last thing, we get back to more normal, as your President Xi has said, normal rules-based international trade, which is where we all need to be.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
What should be done is not what's happening right now. Given what's happened, given what Brussels has introduced, there's restrictive measures against China. Dr. Gong, how do you expect Beijing to react? Is there still room for compromise? Maybe a framework that addresses Europe's concerns while also protecting the legitimate rights and fair treatment of Chinese companies? Or maybe, China, make a benign step first, make a goodwill gesture first. We forget about all those just happened and, have another beginning of this negotiation. Is that possible?
Well, I think the European side understands quite well that China doesn't harbor any sort of vicious and bad will towards Europe. We don't have any design for you, for God's sake. I think from our perspective, we like to enhance economic relationship. We like to see trade to grow, and we like to see that Europe is firmly sticking to its one China policy. That's all about it. If you're talking about a political side. But the problem is, as I see it, is that the European Union leadership right now is basically hijacked by a set of people who are, deeply preoccupied and fixated on this conflict in Ukraine. To some extent, I think, several European countries are indeed engaging a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. And this is their priority. And if they see things from that lens, and from that lens, they see China as sort of siding with Russia, which is totally untrue. I think, the fact that the Ukrainian side is not winning on the battlefield, they're actually retreating on the battlefield, further enhances that view, further reinforces that view. I think that's the problem here. I think the cure is to, wait things to change. I think there's a significant political change in a couple of key European Union countries, and China should, as I said, I don't see much hope of persuading people like von der Leyen, like Kaja Kallas. These people are not going to be persuaded. We have to wait until they're gone to start a new conversation. So I think in the meantime, we should develop closer relationship, fair and using President Trump's reciprocal relationship with countries like Germany, to some extent like France, definitely with Spain, with UK, with other Central European and Eastern European, Southern European countries that do want to develop a good relationship with China. Europe is not it's one bloc, I think. It's not a monolithic bloc. It has different views. And, there are countries that do want to keep good relationship with China. I think it is those countries that still are the anchoring forces of a potentially better relationship between China and Europe.
But they don't have the say right now, right? So can we... Is that a goal, the change of leadership in Europe achievable within the foreseeable future? That's the question.
No, I think I would agree with Dr. John there. I think that you pursue, if not bilateral, multilateral conversations with those countries. You understand what the interests are. There will be people in the European Union who understand the importance of good relationships with China, and we just have to work hard at keeping them going. And, time is a great healer, and things will change, and hopefully will change for the better so that we can get these relationships which are of benefit to both sides. And I think that's where we need to get to, and hopefully need to get there sooner rather than later.
Yeah, let's hope for that. But now that Europe is restructuring its supply chains, how may this shape or reshape Sino-EU economic relations in the years ahead? Dr. Glen?
Yeah, I think that reshaping supply chain relationship is something that people talk a lot about. They talk a lot about it because obviously we've had the context of dealing with COVID, Ukraine and Iran. And, my own president of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply talks about we no longer have linear supply chains, which are very simple to understand. We have supply networks that have to be configured so that we make sure we've got security of supply. Okay, so it's a more complex world. But at the end of the day, it is still the case, particularly, if I look at people who are procuring in the United Kingdom, that any notion, even given, the problems that we did have, making sure that supplies got from China with the challenges of COVID and closures of Suez Canal and all that kind of stuff, people are still procuring in the way that they always have from China. Okay. So again, we have to be very clear that we understand the difference between rhetoric, what is being said, and reality. And there is a lot of noise and a lot of talk. For example, with the tariffs that President Trump was imposing, they're nothing like what he actually suggested in the first instance. The amount that's actually been paid says that the increase in tariffs is somewhere between 2 and 5% on those goods that have actually had the tariffs applied. So there is the noise, which seems to be the modus operandi of politics in the West at the moment, and the reality, the difference between the rhetoric and the reality. Now, it does damage relationships, as we've discussed, but we have to maintain those relationships through this noise, knowing that ultimately it is in the interests of all parties for these relationships to be sustained.
Then under what circumstances do you expect Brussels to maybe return to a more pragmatic approach toward China?
Honestly, I think the pragmatism in terms of what actually happens will be the dominant force. Again, with a lot of these things, there is the rhetoric and the reality. So, if you were to talk to people in the United States, they would think that, there's 25%, 45%, 50% tariffs in place on Chinese goods or on UK goods. What they don't understand, and maybe only economists who study these things, they don't understand that the reality is a lot less. And so we have to dampen that down. We have to realize, and again, in China, you're not encumbered by having to have an election every 3 or 5 years. So you don't get politicians who are playing to, the need to be politically attractive in an election that's going to occur in 2 or 3 months' time, okay, or 2 years' time. So again, there's a lot of talking to the electorate. And at the moment, there is a political belief that, creating these enemies, whether it be immigrants or whether it be, Chinese hegemony in international relationships, is something that gets political votes. And again, I would say that appalling statement that Professor Yon talked about before is not aimed at the Chinese, is actually aimed at getting votes in elections in Europe. And unfortunately, we're in that position at the moment. But again, as Professor Yon said, we've seen recently in Hungary, we've seen recently in Turkey, that narrative is being dismissed by the electorate. So hopefully we see the electorate moving against it.
Right. Dr. Gong, last question to you. Have China-EU economic ties entered a fundamentally irreversible phase of restructuring?
No, I won't call it irreversible. I think it's still very dynamic. I think at least European consumers still very much love products coming from China. They're affordable. They're pretty good. Look at one example, where there's no such tariffs being influenced by the European Union. That's UK, right? Chinese cars, both ICE cars, electric cars are being sold very well over there. So people are voting with their wallet. So I think that still sets a pretty good foundation for a future relationship. I think we need to address the trade deficit issue here. There are ways to work around that. For example, China and Spain are talking about making joint ventures in Spain, increasing FDI from China, creating more jobs in Spain. The same thing can be said in Germany, for example. So there are ways about doing things to address these issues. But at the very fundamental level, there should be a trust in political will. There should be the absence of this kind of a, ill-minded thinking behind it. Again, I want to emphasize that Europe and China are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands miles away. We don't have any political ambition in Europe whatsoever. There's remotely any chance at all of China posing a threat to the European Union. So there shouldn't be such kind of a bad will towards each other. And I'm totally disappointed with the current European Union leadership. I think they're to the stage of incurable. Chemotherapy will not even address that. So we have to wait for change in Europe, in the European political landscape.
Right. And last question to Ms. Liang. Given current economic environment or business vibe in Europe, what suggestions or advice would you give to Chinese investors or businesses who want to do business in the EU? And what would you say to, maybe a last few words from the chamber to, the EU authorities?
Well, I think I would like to put a positive note that I think China and EU are also discussing some ways out.
Right.
And we see that, for instance, for export control, which our European counterparts were concerned of, it was successfully solved via the upgraded mechanism dialogue between China and the EU. So our advice to the companies at the moment is, of course, their compliance is the bottom line. And to operate successfully in Europe, in EU and the UK, you have to be, of course, compliant. This is the first and most important thing. And then we talk about the opportunities for investment and so on. We try to send out our messages that, to tackle what the EU concerns about the trade deficit. A good way is to promote the Chinese investment in EU, to promote their production in Europe. For that, I think you can rethink of a lot of trade tools, for instance, foreign subsidies regulations and its conduct under a lot of FDI screening mechanism, and then to lose and I think to reduce the market access barriers for Chinese investors would be great. But in the short term, it could be very individual that Chinese companies to think about their strategies in Europe. We encourage our members and the wider Chinese business community to attach the importance to the market of Europe. And our survey also suggested that Europe has gained the growing importance for their global strategies. So on the one hand, we are cautiously optimistic about the business landscape. It's still not completely uninvestable. This is not the case, that there are still a lot of opportunities and actually really a huge potential of opportunities for investment, first of all. Secondly, of course, we would like to remind our companies to be cautious about the very complex political debates and the regulatory environment. But thirdly, we would like to ask our companies that to contribute to the construction engagement and to contribute not only to the, a lot of companies, they practice their social responsibility and they committed to the local communities development. And we would like to also encourage them to speak out. I mean, either for Chinese and European business, sometimes our voice are underheard. So I think that from the Chamber's perspective, we would like to encourage more positive and constructive voices from the business community to facilitate healthier development, let's say healthier discussion to promote the stability or the development of the trade and economy issues between the two sides. And I think we are committed to that, and we encourage the wider business community to join us. In the end, we hope that things can get better.
Let's all hope for that. And with that, we conclude our chat for this session. Many thanks to Ms. LIANG Linlin from the China Chamber of Commerce to the European Union, Dr. John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Dr. Glen from the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, Cranfield School of Management as well. For your time and insights, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So drop us a line at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tuyun. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week on the Chat Lounge. Till then, take care and talk soon.
Tales of Chinese Children is a collection of fairy tales and fables written by Edith Eaton, one of the first Asian American women writers from the turn of the 20th century. Edith focused on children who were treasured.
They are the sweetest gift of all.
lost,
Get away from me! Get away from me!
or misunderstood
My son, the evil spirit in your sister had almost lost you to me.
in the complicated adult world, and much more. Search for Books and Beyond on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms to delve into an audio journey which allows the sound to linger around and above you for stunning realism.